You say how many? Listen to this. Of the entire generation that left Egypt, do you know how many entered the promised land? 2. Joshua and Caleb, that's all. Most of them means most of them. Numbers 14:16 says, because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land which he swore to give unto them, therefore he's slain them in the wilderness. And that's, look at the word overthrown. It means strewn. It means strewn all over everywhere. Their corpses were strewn all over the desert. But John, what are you saying? That they lost their salvation? That isn't the issue. Some of them were regenerated in personal faith, and some of them were not, and there's no way. That isn't the point. The point of the illustration is God called them to be a witnessing community, but because of sin, they were disqualified to establish that witnessing community. They were set aside, and a whole new group went into that land of Canaan. And the point is this, they had everything. They had all of the privileges, and they were smug, and they were self-sufficient, and they were self-confident, and they griped their way through the wilderness, and they abused their liberty, and they did just about what they wanted to do in their liberty, always flirting on the thin edge, and they fell into sin, and God let them all go, and they died in the wilderness. Some of those Israelites will be in heaven because they were really believers, but they were disqualified. You can be a believer and be disqualified from service. Listen, even in the church, according to 2 Timothy 2, there are vessels unto honor and dishonor, right? If you purge yourself, you will be a vessel unto honor, fit for what? The master's use. God has to depend upon a minority of Christians to do his ministry because so many of them fail to be qualified. How many people like Israel, how many Christians do you know of who start out in the service of the Lord Jesus Christ and find themselves fall into temptation, they fall into sin, and they are disqualified from serving Christ? Well, they're going to go to heaven. They're going to be regenerated because they have been. But they're useless. And in fact, according to 1 John 5, some of them God just killed. Look at verse 30 of 1 Corinthians 11. For this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. Many are dead. The Lord had to allow some of the Corinthians to be strewn in the desert. Some of the Corinthian corpses should have been living testimony to disqualification in the service of the Lord because of sin. And you know why they got disqualified? You know why some of those Corinthians failed? You know why some of those Corinthians died? Because they lived on the thin edge of their liberty. They ran their liberty right out to its extremity, and they got into temptation they couldn't handle, fell into sin, and were disqualified for service. Look at verse 6, and I'll just introduce point 2, and we'll get into it next time. The abuses of liberty. Verse 6. We saw the assets in the first 5. The abuses begin in verse 6, and it says, now these things were our examples. Paul says, I'm telling you the story to be a tupoi. Tupoi means a model, a type, a pattern. I want you to see an example here. And the example is this. We should not lust after evil things as they lusted. There they were out there enjoying their liberty, and it turned into lust. In Numbers chapter 11, it's really incredible. They were out there. God was supplying every single thing they needed. Then verse 4, it says, they wept, and they said, who will give us flesh to eat? We want meat. We're not vegetarians. We remember, and they didn't like the manna, all we get. Verse 6, our soul is dried away, nothing at all besides this manna before our eyes. I'm reminded when I was a little kid, I used to go to some friend's house, and they kid me even to this day that I always said the same thing because this dear lady always gave me the same thing every time I go there for lunch. Oh, I stayed with them one whole summer. Every day I got the same thing. And I was a little guy, and every time I see them, they always say the same thing. Hello, John, you remember when you used to say soup and sandwiches? Soup and sandwiches. All we ever have here is soup and sandwiches. Well, that's what they essentially were saying here. All we ever get is manna. I mean, enough is enough. So verse 5, we remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, The cucumbers, and their mouths are watering. And the melons and the leeks and the onion and the garlic. And I've often thought with a diet of fish and cucumbers and leeks and onions and garlic, I'd like to keep my distance from that many people. And it says in verse 34, you know what happened? And God killed those that lusted. You know, it's so easy in the Christian life when you take your liberty to its extremity to start looking back over the bank at what you used to have and starting to lust after the old life. That's what he's saying. You Corinthians who are running your liberty right out to its limits are going to face the old patterns and be drawn into those old patterns. And that's what happened to Israel. Let it be an example that when you take your liberties and run them out to their extremes onto that thin edge between what is your right to do and what is sin, you're going to get tempted to fall into old patterns of life. The thing that God redeemed you out of. Let that be a perpetual warning against indulgence of lust for the forbidden objects of the former life. Listen to Psalm 78:27. He rained flesh on them like dust and feathered fowls like the sand of the sea. You know, they said, we want flesh. We want flesh. You know what he did? He gave them so much flesh that he said it came down like dust. They about drowned in it. And feathered fowls like the sand of the sea. I mean, they just got bombed out of heaven. And he let it fall everywhere. And so they ate and got fat. And he gave them their desire. Listen to this. While their food was in their mouths, the wrath of God came upon them and slew the fattest and smote down the chosen men of Israel. For all this they sinned still and believed not in his wondrous works. Therefore their days did he consume in vanity and their years in trouble. You see what they did? They wanted what they wanted, so he gave them what they wanted, and then he took the fattest of them and took their lives. Why? Because he had to purge that kind of thing out of the witnessing community. And that's just the reason some believers may die and go to be with the Lord. Same thing. Because they're more of a problem in the witnessing community than they are an asset. The abuse of liberty leads to a disqualification from ministry and can lead to death. What is this saying to us? Just this: beware of overconfidence.
That's John Macarthur, president of the Master's College and Seminary, on how you can glorify Christ by being set apart from the world and avoiding the pitfalls of Christian liberty. That's the title of his current study here on Grace to You. Now, John, when it comes to this issue